Welcome to the All Sorts Podcast, the one-stop shop for all things curious and intriguing.
Oh.
Today we're diving deep into a topic that's been making headlines and shaping global events for decades, NATO. You've heard the name.
Yeah.
You know it's important, but maybe you're wondering, how does this whole alliance thing actually work?
It's a fascinating case study in international cooperation, especially considering how much the world has changed since NATO's founding.
Right. In 1949, it's like, picture a neighborhood watch.
Sure.
But instead of houses, its entire country is looking out for each other, but with a lot more treaties and military exercise, I'm guessing. So let's start with the basics. NATO.int tells us there are 32 member countries. And get this.
That's right.
It's been expanding.
And that expansion is actually a key point of controversy, as we'll see later. But it speaks to how NATO has adapted to a changing geopolitical landscape.
And it makes you wonder who could join next. Because apparently Article 10...
That Article 10 is crucial. It essentially lays out the rules of the club, and it's been a source of both hope and tension, depending on who you ask.
Ooh, that's where things get juicy. Okay, rewind back to 1949. Who were the original 12 members that started all this?
Well, you had a mix of North American and European powers. Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the UK, and the US. A pretty solid transatlantic alliance from the get-go.
And some of those early players really shaped NATO's future. NATO.int mentions Paul-Henri Spaak from Belgium. He was a founding foreign minister and later became NATO Secretary General.
Talk about being dedicated to the cause. It shows how those early leaders had a vision for a lasting security framework, and they were willing to put in the work to make it happen. But it wasn't always smooth sailing, even within the alliance. France, for example.
Oh, yeah. What was up with that? They were one of the founders.
Exactly. But in 1966, France decided to withdraw from NATO's military structure while still remaining a member of the alliance itself.
So they were basically saying, we're in the club, but we're doing our own thing.
France, under President Charles de Gaulle, wanted to assert its independence, particularly regarding its nuclear strategy. They felt that being fully integrated into NATO's military command structure limited their autonomy.
That's a bold move, considering the whole point of NATO is collective defense. But hold on. NATO.int also says that even after withdrawing from the military structure, France continued to contribute troops.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It highlights the nuances of international alliances. France was willing to cooperate on a case-by-case basis. Based on its own national interests. They weren't fully in, but they weren't entirely out either. And in 2009, under President Nicolas Sarkozy, France fully rejoined NATO's military structure, signaling a shift in their strategic thinking.
Okay. So it's more complicated than just in or out.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that these alliances are constantly evolving, reflecting changing global dynamics and national priorities.
Speaking of evolving, let's bring in Wikipedia now.
It's a great resource for understanding how NATO's mission has expanded beyond its initial Cold War focus on containing the Soviet Union.
Right. Wikipedia talks about NATO's involvement in various operations after the Cold War ended. They mention interventions.
These operations show a clear shift in NATO's approach from primarily deterrence to a more proactive role in international crisis management and intervention.
Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and even Libya. It makes you realize that NATO's reach goes far beyond just Europe and North America. They're dealing with conflicts.
And that's where some of the biggest controversies arise. The question of when and where to intervene and the potential consequences of those interventions are hotly debated.
And security issues
all
over the world now. Which brings us to another point. Wikipedia highlights the ongoing debate.
Oh, yes. That's a complex issue with major geopolitical implications. We need to remember that while some countries see NATO expansion as a guarantee of their security, others, particularly Russia, view it as a direct threat.
Okay, so we've got this tension building between NATO's desire to expand.
Exactly. And this tension has been a key factor in shaping the security landscape in Europe, particularly in recent years.
And Russia's perception of that expansion as encroaching on its sphere of influence.
But before we get into that, let's take a quick step back and look at how this debate about enlargement has played out historically. After the Cold War ended, many former Warsaw Pact countries and Soviet republics saw joining NATO as a way to ensure their security and independence.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Yeah. Especially for countries that had been under Soviet control for decades. Joining NATO would be like a giant keep-off sign for Russia.
Exactly. And countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were eager to join. They saw NATO membership as a way to solidify their new democracies and integrate into the West. Their accession to NATO in 1999 marked a significant eastward expansion.
But that must have, of the alliance.
You're absolutely right.
Really rattled Russia.
Russia has consistently viewed NATO enlargement as a hostile act, a betrayal of promises made after the Cold War.
Having NATO, this alliance that was originally formed to counter them, suddenly right on their doorstep.
They argue that expanding NATO undermines their security interests and creates instability in the region.
And things escalated even further when the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
It was a huge turning point. Joined NATO in 2004.
Those countries share a border with Russia, so I can see why that would be a red line for them.
It solidified NATO's presence in the former Soviet sphere of influence, and it really heightened tensions with Russia. And then, of course, we have the case of Ukraine.
Yeah, Ukraine which has been aspiring to join NATO for years.
Yeah.
A major flashpoint in this whole debate. Wikipedia mentions how they've been trying to get into NATO, but it's been super complicated.
That conflict, especially with the ongoing conflict with Russia, which began in 2014 with Russia's annexation of Crimea and support for separatists in eastern Ukraine, has really thrown a wrench into the works. It's created a dilemma for NATO. Accepting Ukraine could be seen as a direct challenge to Russia, potentially escalating the conflict further. But rejecting Ukraine's bid could leave them vulnerable and send a signal that NATO is willing to appease.
It's a tough spot. Russian aggression, for sure. You can see the arguments on both sides. On one hand, you have Ukraine's desire to protect itself and exercise its sovereignty. On the other, you have the risk of provoking a larger conflict with Russia with potentially devastating consequences.
It's a balancing act with incredibly high stakes. And it raises fundamental questions about NATO's core principles and its commitment to collective defense. How far is NATO willing to go to defend a country that's not yet a member? And what message does their decision send to other countries seeking NATO's protection?
So this whole debate about enlargement really gets to the heart of what NATO is all about, its role in the world, and the challenges it faces in navigating a complex geopolitical landscape. It makes you realize that this isn't just some abstract concept.
It's about real people. NATO's decisions have real-world consequences, real countries, and the very real threat of conflict for people's lives.
And it's a reminder that these issues, the future of international security,
are rarely black and white. There are multiple perspectives, competing interests, and difficult choices to be made.
And it brings us back to something we discussed earlier, that Article 10 about any European state being able to join.
That's the million-dollar question.
If NATO is all about collective defense and deterring aggression,
there's no easy answer. Is it obligated to accept any country?
And it's something that meets the criteria
that NATO leaders grapple with constantly, even if it risks provoking a conflict. They have to weigh the principles of the alliance with a major power like Russia against the potential risks and consequences of their action.
And I imagine those decisions are even more complex.
Absolutely.
When you factor in the issue of defense spending.
The issue of burden sharing.
NATO.int mentions that members have committed to contributing at least 2% of their GDP to defense.
It has been a recurring theme in NATO's history.
But Wikipedia points out
the United States
that this has been a source of tension.
As the largest and most powerful member within the alliance, with some countries arguing that others has often pushed for other countries aren't pulling their weight
to increase their defense spending. It's like a giant group project.
Arguing that they need to share the responsibility.
Where some people are slacking off for collective defense while others are doing all the work.
And this issue of burden sharing, and it can create resentment and divisions,
has become even more contentious in recent years within the alliance.
With the rise of new security challenges.
So you're saying that NATO is facing pressure like cyber warfare and terrorism.
Exactly.
Not just from external threats like Russia, but also from internal divisions.
And that makes navigating
over how to share the costs and responsibilities of defense.
These complex geopolitical issues even more challenging. NATO has to maintain unity and solidarity among its members, while also adapting to a rapidly changing security environment.
It's a tall order. So what does this all mean?
Well, for the average person listening to this podcast, why should they care about NATO? Well, NATO's actions and decisions have a ripple effect on global security and stability. They influence international relations, defense spending, and even the possibility of conflict. What happens in Europe?
And even if you don't live or in any region where NATO is involved in a NATO country has implications.
That's a great analogy for the entire world.
It's still affected by the decisions they make. It's like a giant game of chess.
And it's important to remember that
being played on a global scale.
These aren't just abstract issues.
And we're all part of the board.
They have real-world consequences.
So we've covered a lot of ground.
To people's lives.
From NATO's founding principles.
For the global economy.
And historical evolution. To its controversial expansion.
And for the future of international cooperation.
And its role in modern conflicts.
And we've seen how NATO has adapted and transformed over the years, facing new challenges and grappling with complex dilemmas.
But one thing's for sure. NATO remains a crucial player on the global stage, shaping international security and influencing the course of history. It really makes you think about the power dynamics at play and how even seemingly small decisions can have massive consequences. As we wrap up this deep dive, I have a final thought, and this one's a bit out there.
Interesting. What do you have in mind?
What if NATO expanded its mission beyond traditional military alliances? What if they tackled global issues like climate change or pandemics?
Thought-provoking idea.
We've seen how interconnected the world is, how these problems don't respect borders.
It would certainly require a reimagining of NATO's structure and purpose, moving beyond.
Could NATO become a force for cooperation on these fronts, bringing nations together to solve some of humanity's biggest challenges?
Absolutely. Exactly.
And who knows? But hey, that's what the All Sorts podcast is all about, right? Exploring different perspectives.
Maybe someday NATO will be known.
And pushing the boundaries of our understanding.
Not just as a military alliance, but as a global force for good, tackling a wider range of threats to humanity's well-being.
That's a future I think we can all get behind. But for now, we've reached the end of our deep dive into NATO.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us.
Exploring these complex issues with you.
On this journey of discovery. And remember, dear listeners, the world is full of fascinating topics, just waiting to be explored. Let the All Sorts podcast be your compass, guiding you through a universe of diverse topics and perspectives. Hit that like button, share this episode with your fellow explorers, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to join our growing community of curious minds. Follow us on X.Instagram and Threads to stay connected and be a part of the conversation. Let's embark on this adventure of knowledge together.